Well, aloha and welcome. Tonight is the first webinar in a month-long series to raise awareness about invasive species. It's called the Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month, or Hi Sam. I would never make it as a weather person. For a full schedule of events, you can go to the Hawaii Invasive Species Council page, which I think the link will be dropped into the chat, or you can follow your favorite invasive species committee on social media. We will be keeping you posted. So before we really get into this, we are going to release a poll, which should be coming out very soon. And, you know, your time is valuable and we really appreciate you here joining us. And thank you for taking the time to fill out this poll. It helps us with demographics and just knowing how to better serve our community in the future. So while that poll is happening, we'll go over some quick housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded like most Hi Sam videos. And it's good that we're recording it because if you have family, friends, or colleagues that can't tune in live tonight, they can go to the Hawaii Invasive Species Council YouTube page and find a plethora of really great webinars from past Hi Sams and the ones we'll be doing this month in February. We are also streaming live on social media on the BISC Facebook page, and probably the other ISCs will share as well. We have a full team here, almost our full team from BISC here, our outreach team. So my name's Molly Murphy, and I'm the plant pono specialist from BISC, and I will be your host. We have Jade Miyashiro, our arthropod technician. She will be monitoring social media for questions and comments. And then we have Kavehi Yan, who will be monitoring our the chat and Q&A on the Zoom. So we just all want to take a minute, Kavehi, to give you a warm mahalo for putting all these Hi Sam graphics together and for making this amazing webinar slide deck. We are so lucky to have you as our colleague, and just want you to know we all appreciate you a lot. So we have a full panel of speakers here to provide information on the myths regarding invasive species. And we are so open to questions and comments, but please respect our guests and panelists. Invasive species can sometimes be a complicated subject. So, sorry. So we just want to make sure that we are clearing up any like muddy ideas or like misconceptions. The things that we do to protect agriculture, watersheds, native forest, and the coral reefs can sometimes seem controversial. But tonight we're going to clear it all up. So again, put your questions in the Q&A or chat, and each presenter will answer it at the end because we have a lot going on tonight. We can't stop with each presenter. So if you scroll down at the bottom of your Zoom, there's two different ways to put things in, Q&A or the chat. And like I said, either one is good. But if you do the Q&A, it's a lot easier for us to keep track and make sure we're answering any, comments, concerns, or questions that you have. We have a packed panel tonight with experts representing almost all the islands. So this is going to be an exciting night. We have Trevor Johansson, the Department of Aquatic Resources AIS Fishery Technician. We have Erin Bishop, the Oahu Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator. We have Tea Penniman, the Maui Invasive Species Acting Manager. And Tiffany Keanini, the Kauai Invasive Species Committee Manager. Kim Rogers, Outreach Specialist Extraordinaire from the Kauai Invasive Species Committee. And finally, we have Franny Brewer, who is the BISC manager. And we're very excited to say that for the first time out loud. Our last manager stepped down and we were so sorry to see her go. But Franny Brewer stepped up and took over and did 2 full-time jobs since May. And now finally she has stepped into her new role. So we are so thankful. So without further ado, we will get to the webinar. So yeah, let's get into this. Here is Trevor. And am I sharing correctly? I think I got a message saying I'm not.
You can start sharing now.
Oh, I didn't start sharing yet. Sorry about that. Stand by. Oh gosh. Well, we practiced this, but for some reason.
And I just want to say while you're setting that up that we are, because we are live on Facebook, that if folks over on Facebook have questions, as Molly introduced Jade Miyashiro from our BISC team, she's following the Facebook. So I know you don't have access to the Q&A or the chat, but Jade is there on Facebook. You can type your questions in there and she will also pass them through to the panelists.
Thank you, Franny. So can we see my screen now? All right. Thank you, Trevor. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, so yeah, as Molly was saying, there's a lot of myths out there, unfortunately, about invasive species. And so one of them that I wanted to discuss that we hear a lot as managers is that invasive species are just arbitrarily decided. You can go ahead and change the next slide. But yeah, that they're arbitrarily decided. But in fact, we have clear definitions from the federal government and our state government on what constitutes an invasive species. So first off, let's set this record here with native species. These are species that have arrived on their own without the help of humans, you know, from thousands of years ago. And this has allowed them to co-evolve together and in a way that has established a stable ecosystem. You know, they can survive without the detriment of their fellow species. And this is in contrast to invasive species, which cause harm to the species around them. Right. So here in Hawaii, we are pretty isolated, as we know. Historically, you know, the 3 M's, the 3 ways that species came here naturally is the makani, the wind, so small seeds that were able to blow high up in the atmosphere and land here. Manu, or wings, so obviously the bird species that could fly directly here, but also more importantly, all the little insects that can fit in their feathers and drop off here, or seeds that are in their digestive tract that are excreted here. That's another way. And then finally, we have the moana, or the waves, all the seeds and plants that can float, and animals too, that can float in the water over that huge distance and survive until they reach the shores and become established here. So that's the natural way, in contrast to invasive species where it's almost entirely human-mediated introductions. And so this is the definition that we have. It's a 2-part definition. It was originally established in 1999 by President Bill Clinton when he signed an order defining this as part 1 are non-native species to the ecosystem to which they've been introduced. So that's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand, not too many misconceptions there. Where it gets a little tricky is part 2, and that says that the invasive species are species in which their introduction has caused or is likely to cause harm in one of 3 areas. And so that would be the environment, the economy, and so that's a pretty broad term. Think about things like agriculture, anything that could affect agriculture, farmland, you know, that's part of the economy. Here in Hawaii, tourism is a big part of our economy. So anything that could cause any kind of harm to any tourism here in Hawaii. That's a pretty broad topic. And then a third area is if the species causes or is likely to cause any harm to human health. And then, so also in 2000, here in Hawaii, we have a fourth area of concern, which is if any species causes or is likely to cause harm to our way of life here. And so that's kind of a broad definition. And I think sometimes those can get a little bit confusing. That's where there's some gray area in kind of the vague statements. And also people get mixed up where it says it's likely to cause harm. So that means it doesn't actually have to be causing harm as we see it, but if scientific studies show, or if research has shown that it's possible that it will likely cause harm in the future, then even then it can be labeled as an invasive species and managed in such a way. Okay. And so I wanted to take the time real fast to also separate introduced species from invasive species. Introduced species, obviously, is pretty simple. Anything that's not native here, like as I covered before. And, that can include things like the canoe crops that the ancient Polynesians brought with them. All the staple crops that they survived on, things like kalo, that it's been here a long time, but it's not native, but it's not really causing harm in any of those areas that I'd mentioned. Since it's not causing any harm, it's not labeled invasive, simply introduced, and no problems there. But the picture on the right is smothering seaweed from Kaneohe Bay. And you can see in that picture, clearly smothering corals causing high damage to the coral ecosystem, potentially causing damage to the tourism industry in Kaneohe Bay and other areas. So pretty easily, clearly labeled an invasive species. All right, and also only 10 to 15% of introduced species actually become invasive. Again, a couple of easy contrasts. Starfruit, is an introduced fruit. It's not native here, but it's not taking over. It's not harming any other plants in the ecosystem, compared to strawberry guava, where clearly we see large tracts of forest land that's taken over by strawberry guava. It grows so closely together that it outcompetes a lot of native species, clearly causing harm to the ecosystem. And I want to point out here too that I think a lot of times the public has the misconception that managers work in order to retroactively kind of, things become established here and we work after the fact to try to manage them the best we can, that is true. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things that become established and we can't eradicate them in time. But also here at DAR, at the Division of Aquatic Resources, we implement as-ISC screening tool. So that stands for Aquatic Species Invasive Screening Tool. And we use that, and there are also a lot of other terrestrial similar tools that terrestrial folks use to screen out species that have a high invasive potential. And so we can look at species from the mainland, from species from China, all over, and it puts in a ton of information into this software, looking at things like habitat suitability and looking at the habitat of a species native range compared to here in Hawaii, looking at a species reproductive output, its lifespan, a lot of things like that, and it'll crunch all those numbers that we put in and spit out an invasiveness factor. And so then we can use that proactively instead of reactively and manage species. We can regulate species, even we can ban them from importation. Some species that have a super high invasive potential, we can even ban from bringing to the state. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as well, that we do work proactively and not reactively to everything. So thanks.
Okay, so moving on to the next one that we hear a lot, because invasive species, as Trevor shared, things that came from another place and are not native to a place. And so we've seen this thrown out, that invasive species is a xenophobic concept. And xenophobia is a very real phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon where it's mostly referring to, when humans that are looking at populations of refugees or immigrants coming into an area, other groups of humans, and expressing bad feelings about that, or being unkind. And sometimes I see this a lot with journalists or magazine writers. Sometimes they'll take that concept of xenophobia and they'll project that onto invasive species work and say, well, that's just an extension of xenophobia, that you just don't like things from other places. And I'm not totally comfortable with that, because we're talking about a phenomena that's between humans, which are members of the same species, versus things that are happening in ecosystems that are between members of different species, right? We don't look at lionesses taking down an antelope on the Serengeti and say that's murder and it's a conspiracy to commit murder, right? So it's not a really good fit to move to take a human concept and apply that to an ecological system. Molly? So one of the things that I really want to share with that is, I love this imagery. I'm going to use the spotted lanternfly as an example. If we really want to think about how these incoming forces are, it's not so much comparable to refugees or immigrants, it's really comparable to invaders, conquering forces, bullies. And this imagery, which comes from Pennsylvania, really captures this idea so well. We found this in a newspaper, and it's referring to the spotted lanternfly. Obviously, this is not a picture to scale. That would probably be much bigger news. But this is an insect that's native to China, that it was introduced into the East Coast within the last 10 years, and it has really taken over. So if you look at that image that's in the lower left corner, you just see spotted lanternflies all over that tree. And that's what people were experiencing and are experiencing. They're coming out of their houses and there's spotted lanternflies covering trees, covering their cars, covering houses. They're all over the sidewalk. People are stomping on them. They really had that sense of an invading force just coming in and disrupting things and taking things over and changing the way that things are. And that's really, if you're going to compare any kind of human experience, it's much more invasive species. The word invasive is not an accident. It's much more the experience of being invaded upon. And that's because these species have characteristics that lead them to be something of bullies. They grow and mature very quickly. They produce a lot of offspring, whether that's seeds or that's babies, things that are going to multiply very quickly, and those offspring are going to spread. If you're a plant that can produce a seed that is carried by birds, that bird is a really good dispersal mechanism to carry your offspring all over the place, really give you that chance to be very aggressive in your new environment and take over your new environment. You're not limited to maybe a small elevational area or a small temperature range. You really have the ability to spread into a lot of zones. All of those things are going to lead to you being an invasive species. So, I really thought this was a great image to give people that sense. We don't have the spotted lanternfly in Hawaii yet. So, but we are worried about it getting here. So number one, if you see anything that looks like this, take a moment to look at that bug, so that if you do see that in Hawaii, you know to report that, 643pest.org, very quickly. And also, I think what's really important about this is that is the city of Philadelphia, my hometown. Go Eagles. Next slide, Molly. That really fits into this other sort of sense of, we hear this a lot. You don't like it because it's not native. And when you're saying, oh, you don't like it because it's not native, that implies that there's only two categories, right? There's only, it's either native or it's invasive. But that again misses that whole category that Trevor brought up, introduced species, right? Sorry, I lost my place here. There's a third category, introduced species. Molly. Sorry, we're not changing our own slides, so. Oh, there it is, okay.
Sorry, I missed the cue. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'll spend more time. I was so riveted. I was like, go Eagles. Sorry.
So when we talk about introduced species, right, those are things that are not native. And lychee, for instance, is something that's not native to Hawaii. It's actually from China, same place as the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive species. But would we consider lychee to be an invasive species? Well, let's look at that second part of the definition. Is lychee harming the environment? Do we see it going out into the forest and preventing koa from growing, preventing ohia from growing? No, we don't. Do we see it harming the economy? Well, no, actually, it's a benefit to the economy, right? It's something that can be farmed. It's a crop. This is something that produces income for folks. Is it harming health? Well, I've heard of some people having some allergic reaction where it doesn't feel, you know, they get the itchiness around the mouth, but mostly fruit is pretty good for our health. And I haven't heard of anybody ending up hospitalized from lychee poisoning. And so overall, it's really just a benefit to us and a benefit to our health. It's really nice to have in our backyards. We would never consider that an invasive species. Yes, it's from someplace else. Yes, it's from China, just like spotted lanternfly, but lychee is not having that impact of harm. Let's look at another tree like albizia. Albizia causes severe economic harm. We have documented millions and millions of dollars of economic harm in Hawaii. Does it cause environmental harm? Yes, we have documentation. These trees grow up, they create such a massive amount of shade that native forests underneath cannot replenish, right? The plants are not getting access to the sun. Does it cause harm to our health and way of life? Absolutely. At least one person has died in Hawaii because of falling albizia. Many people have been injured. We've had many houses crushed, cars crushed, you know, all kinds of roadside incidents. So this is something that is considered really dangerous. And when we think about all of the things that people sort of say, oh yes, I'm okay with that invasive species being treated, those are generally things that fall into those last two categories, right? Things that cause economic harm or things that cause harm to health. You don't hear a lot of pushback or people saying, well, that's just a xenophobic concept when we say, well, we want to get rid of semi-slugs or we want to try and control semi-slugs, which are the main carrier for rat lungworm disease. And the reason why is because that's such a serious impact to health. And we know that that's something that has to be controlled.
Most invasive plants in Hawaii, about 90% of them were brought here intentionally by humans because they wanted to use them for some reason. Unfortunately, they were usually brought here without knowing the consequences of the introduction and that they would ultimately be invasive here in Hawaii and have negative impacts. Some examples of that could be invasive plants were brought here for horticulture because people admired the way they look, fountain grass, Himalayan ginger, or the way they smell, night blooming jasmine, Himalayan ginger again, or because they could provide shade or even ground cover for your yard. They're also intentionally introduced because of their edible fruit, strawberry guava, for example, or as forage for livestock, guinea grass. I don't think that's on here though. So all these plants are introduced because people found a desirable trait within them. Next. Let's look at strawberry guava as an example of bust a few myths while we look at it. First misconception is that strawberry guava might be native. It's actually native to Brazil and introduced by people in many places around the world, as you can see in this map. That green dot is where it's native in Brazil. All the red dots show where it was introduced by humans. Most of them now consider it invasive due to its negative impacts in the area. In Hawaii, it was introduced in 1825 because of its edible fruits. And over the last 2 centuries almost, people have become very accustomed to it and its many uses, but it's not native. As many of us know, we like to use it for jams, juices, jellies, and other food products. The wood is also used for firewood or for smoked meat. Next. So what makes strawberry guava invasive? It's useful, right? Well, it invades up to about 4,000 feet across the island chain. It forms these dense monotypic stands where nothing else can grow in the area. You can look at the pictures on the right, show that. The place displaces native species and replaces our native habitat. Due to its abundant fruit production and very high viable seed production, strawberry guava stands can also provide a refuge for invasive fruit flies, as Brandy mentioned earlier. Rats, pigs, and non-native species or bird species eat the fruits and spread them well beyond their fruiting trees, causing it to be introduced to new areas and spread across our forested watershed. So the pictures on the left, you can see some of that in action. The picture on the top left is actually seedlings growing from pig scat here in Kokee. Thank you, KRCP, for the picture. Strawberry guava forests lose about 25% more water than our native ohia forests. Because of all these impacts, yes, it is invasive. While strawberry guava is very delicious and is used in a variety of foods, it is also an invasive plant that is negatively impacting our forested watershed, and it needs to be managed. The last myth for strawberry guava is that the goal of strawberry guava management is not to take away the plant completely and eradicate it from the island. The goal of the management across the islands is to keep it from spreading and choking out our native forests.
Thank you, Tiffany. And I'm Kim Rogers, and I also work at Kauai Invasive Species Committee. And I am here to bust a myth that goes, it's not in my backyard, so I don't have to worry about it. Or something similar, it's not invasive in my yard, so what's the big deal? Well, here are some things to think about. First, wind. Did you know albizia trees are able to produce seeds by 4 years of age, and that their seeds are spread in the wind, allowing them to spread quickly over large areas? For instance, in the Rainbow Falls area of Hilo, albizia population grew from 10 acres to 35 acres in 15 years. That's a 253% increase. And in doing so, it blocked some beautiful scenic view planes in the area. Second, let's talk about the African tulip that's in the middle of this slide, the middle photo. It was imported to Hawaii in 1871 by Dr. William Hillebrand, has a beautiful orange kind of tulip or cup-shaped blossom. Recently, the Division of Forestry and Wildlife of the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources designated this tree as one of Hawaii's most invasive horticultural plants. The tree grows up to 6 feet per year. Its seeds are numerous, and yes, they are also dispersed in the wind. Then the photo on the right, koa haole, or also known as haole koa, same thing, wind dispersed seeds. What all of this means is if any of these are growing near you, they can easily find their way to your yard. And if they are growing on your property, they will pop up in your neighbor's yards. If they're growing in the forest, they can choke out native plants, creating erosion problems during heavy rains, and even coat the coral with sediment, potentially killing off the reef and its inhabitants. But wind isn't the only concern. Birds get in on the act too. Take the common ornamental landscaping plant known as fiddlewood. It's the photo on the left. It's also known as juniper berry. Ironically, its original introduction to Hawaii was to feed non-native birds. It's those same non-native birds that are now spreading invasive species across Hawaii, including fiddlewood, which is now considered a pest on all of the major Hawaiian islands. So just 3 of these fruit-eating non-native birds that are very common at our lower elevations, literally just in about everybody's backyard. They are contributing to spreading invasive plants and trees from your yard potentially into a neighbor's yard. Here's another thing to think about, is how invasive species move around the island and or inter-island. And that is infected wood. You've probably heard of rapid ohia death. It's a fungal disease that's killed hundreds of trees on Kauai and over 1 million on Hawaii Island. In 2016, a quarantine rule went into place that requires inspection of all ohia plants and plant parts before leaving Hawaii Island. Right after that rule went into place, ohia posts were packed up and headed for Kauai, but before they could depart Hawaii Island, they had to be inspected by the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, and lo and behold, they tested positive for the fungal pathogen that leads to rapid ohia death. Now, in that case, thankfully, unfortunately, in that case, the deadly fungus was caught in the posts, but fortunately, the shipment could be stopped in time before it left one island and moved to another and potentially infected other trees elsewhere. This leads me to biosecurity. A recent survey of Hawaii residents shows that the vast majority, 93% of Hawaii residents, consider invasive species to be a serious issue. So what we like to encourage is be part of the solution. In fact, in order to help prevent the spread of rapidohia death, before and after you spend time in the forest, we encourage good biosanitation practices. What do we mean by that? First, remove as much mud off your footwear and gear as possible. Second, then spray your footwear and or gear that's had mud on it with isopropyl rubbing alcohol. 70% will do fine. And if and when you ever see a boot brush station, no matter if your boots look muddy or not, always use it, because you never know what microscopic pathogens might be hitchhiking on your boots. So biosecurity, we can't recommend it enough. And in fact, just last week, a new biosecurity exhibit went up at the Honolulu airport. So next time you're traveling, if you're going through the Mauka concourse in Terminal 1, stop by and check out this display. It's amazing. It's the photo on the top right on the slide here. It's interactive and it's very educational. Educating yourself on what an invasive species is the great first step in the fight against invasive species. Please also consider, in addition to educating yourself, be a good neighbor. Don't plant invasive species. Instead, plant pono. Visit plantpono.org, the website, to find the perfect plant for your yard or your property that won't invade your neighborhood. Also, another thing you can do is speak up. Encourage your neighborhood board or association to plant pono. If you see something invasive growing at your child's school, be the squeaky wheel and ask them to remove it. And as I mentioned before, report invasive species to 643pest.org. Lastly, it doesn't hurt to encourage your legislators to support our statewide biosecurity plan and efforts. Finally, to wrap up and to bust that original myth that I shared, remember, invasive species are everyone's problems. Hawaii's fragile native ecosystems need everybody's help. Please help.
That's a great message, Kim. So I'm going to jump to a myth that I think a lot of people like to sort of soothe themselves with, which is, well, yes, these are all serious problems. Invasive species is a serious problem, but nature will balance itself out. And people tend to use that as a sort of panacea. But I have to include this because I think we all remember this iconic moment when Jeff Goldblum shared with us all this idea that life finds a way, right? That's where this idea comes from. Well, nature is out there. Nature will take care of this. Life will find a way. And that's a nice soothing thought. And it really lets us off the hook. We don't have to do anything. But Jeff did not mean this as a soothing thought. This wasn't meant to be a comforting thought. He meant this as a warning, because we're talking vast destruction when humans are coming in and they're messing around with something, and it's really going to take a human response to be able to fix that. There is a sense that a lot of folks have that nature is separate from us, right? We have humans and the human world here, and then there's nature out there, and it's separate from humans. And that's not something that all cultures, that's not a viewpoint that all cultures share. Certainly a lot of indigenous cultures, Hawaiian culture, the viewpoint is very much that humans are a part of nature. And so our actions within this system have impacts. And, you know, there's a sense of kuleana for those impacts. I think the inclination to think nature will take care of it really comes from that sense of worldview. But we've been messing around when we have been taking things and moving them around the world in ways that are not nature, not natural, not part of nature. Unfortunately, that can have really severe impacts. So when you look at something like, we've all seen on the news lots of information over the last few years about wildfire, right? Wildfires are getting worse. across the United States and across the world. And so when we look at this, this is just one, I'm going to talk about one grass, one invasive species. A lot of people don't realize it's not just climate change. Invasive species are a huge contributor to wildfire around the world. And picking just one grass that's invading in Western North America, cheatgrass. Now, this grass came in, it's very different from the grasses that were there. If you look at that map in 1988 versus 2018, really what you're looking to see is you're seeing as things turn, yellow, orange, red, there's more and more of this grass moving in. And why is that a problem? Well, there was already grass in that area. There were already grasslands that were adapted to wildfire, but those wildfires happened every 60 to 100 years, right? That leaves a lot of room for recovery in between. And the species that were burning, they were fire adapted, but they're perennial grasses. And anybody who's a grower knows your perennials come up year after year, right? Cheatgrass comes in and it's an annual grass. It grows up, it seeds, and it dies, completely dies immediately, which creates a very, very dry plant, as opposed to a perennial, which maintains some moisture in it. So it's not going to burn as hot and it's not going to burn as fast. When you get into perennials or annual grasses, now you're just creating fire fuel. Once that plant has died, it's an intense fuel. It's going to burn very hot. And now we have fires that are occurring in places, sometimes at less than 5 years separation between fires. That's not enough time for the ecosystem to recover. So a lot of times, people are thinking, well, nature will take care of that. Look past the yellow, the red, the orange, even the green, and you can see that there are state lines drawn in there. These are entire states in the Western United States that you're looking at. There are people living in there, lots of people. And so even if you're thinking, oh, well, that's not, I'll just let nature take care of it. That's not really how it works, because nature is going to come upon you, right? Like nature's not going to leave you out of it. It's not going to leave humans out of it. We are part of this system. And what we see each year on the news, we see massive destruction, massive loss of property, massive loss of life. And these impacts are not just towards humans. These impacts also affect the rest of nature that's out there. I'm sure people remember this was a very devastating occurrence in 2020 in Australia. Huge wildfires across Australia. This is a worldwide problem. And again, pointing out that a grass, an invasive species, more than one grass, I'm just picking one again, in this case, gamba grass, 12 feet walls of vegetation just create literally just a 12-foot wall of fire. But what was lost there, not just the homes, the towns, loss of human life, but they're estimating 3 billion animals, 3 billion animals. And Australia has a lot of endangered species, very similar to Hawaii. And many of those endangered species lost 80% of their remaining habitat. So they're already restricted to a much smaller zone than they used to have, prior to humans interfering. And now that zone has gotten even smaller. So this is something where, when you're talking about, okay, well, we'll let nature handle it, maybe nature needs some help. And humans really need to step up and take some kuleana for that and make sure that we're part of the solution. One of the interesting things about wildfire, it's not just happening in Australia and, in the United States and Canada, it's happening here in Hawaii at an alarming rate. And I want to put in a little commercial for this. If you have your phone, you want to take a quick picture of that QR code up there in the corner. We are having a webinar coming up that's really going to dive a lot deeper into wildfire. So moving on.
Another myth that comes up a lot is that people think there's nobody doing anything about a lot of these invasive species. They're very common and a lot of people have them in their yard and they see them in their community, but they really don't know if anybody's doing anything about it. But that's not exactly true. So aside from habitat loss, invasive species pose the biggest threat to natural resources and the ecosystem services that they provide. This is flood control, erosion control, wildfire prevention, like Franny mentioned. It's also prevents water capture and decreases water quality. But invasive species also affect the integrity of our economy and the agriculture and the health of the residents here in Hawaii. Because invasive species impact all of those areas, every single department in the state of Hawaii has some sort of invasive species management plan built into it. This slide just shows a few, however, there's many, many more. So for example, the Department of Health is concerned about invasive species, especially with mosquitoes. They're concerned with dengue fever and Zika virus. The Department of Transportation is concerned with invasive species, especially when it comes to invasive trees like albizia. If they fall and block the roadways, it prevents emergency services from getting through to helping people that are suffering from any sort of storm issues. The Board of Water Supply, that's the Honolulu Board of Water Supply in the bottom left-hand corner, they're concerned about invasive plants invading the watersheds because, as Tiffany mentioned, they reduce the amount of water that's captured and filtered into our aquifers. So every department in the state of Hawaii does some sort of invasive species management. The annual budget for invasive species management is minuscule compared to what we spend here in Hawaii. The budget for 2024 is $8.73 billion. However, less than 1% of that gets funneled to DLNR, Department of Land and Natural Resources, and only 0.2% goes to Department of Agriculture. And as we talk about biosecurity, preventing these things from coming into the state is absolutely important. It saves us a lot of time and money. So if we can stop it before it gets established, that's our best economic savings. So while we just spend $57 million a year across all agencies, that's only 0.4% of the budget that's dedicated to biosecurity. However, if we could increase that just 0.3%, that's $37.8 million, we can actually start supporting all of the actions in an existing biosecurity plan. That additional 0.3% would have an exponential savings in the billions. And this is from agricultural production, which also leads to food security. It will protect one of our biggest economic drivers, which is tourism at $15 billion. It also helps our floriculture and horticultural trade. But beyond that, it also protects our watersheds and thereby, again, our water supply. It protects our nearshore reefs from sedimentation, from erosion. It protects our native species that are already suffering and that are threatened and endangered. But it will also, in the future, preserve a resiliency for Hawaii in the face of some climate change and weather patterns that could absolutely affect things like our water capture.
Is it true they don't know what they're doing? Aloha, I'm Tia Penniman with the Maui Invasive Species Committee, and I plan to unpack some of the thoughts behind this myth. Let's start with who they are, because there's often a disconnect, an idea that some random people in an office somewhere are deciding what's invasive. Erin highlighted a lot of the agencies and organizations involved in the work. I want to highlight the folks who work in the field, tracking down plants, ants, frogs, snakes, and even mosquitoes. They're inspectors at the ports and harbors. Many have degrees in botany or education or wildlife management. They include folks who are experts at identifying tiny insects and rare plants. They collect data and make maps. They share information in classrooms and at public events. And they also include community members who give their time, talent, and treasure to help do the work. Let's talk about targets. We heard from our earlier speakers about some of the distinctions between introduced and invasive species, but how do they pick what to work on? Before a decision is made to take on a new target species, resource managers first assess the potential harm posed by a particular species. They do that using standard tools or protocols. Trevor talked about some of those tools, including the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment, which is a great example. Devilweed, a current target on Oahu, scores out as high risk, but lemons not so much. This kind of tool can be helpful when we need to evaluate a species that is new to an island. In general, we need to consider, as we heard from other speakers, about how a species spreads and reproduces. Does it fly far and wide like a rose-ringed parakeet, or not really, like a little fire ant? Does it have seeds that are easily spread on the wind, or does it hitchhike on plant materials or cars? How long will it take? If there are effective control methods, and what will it cost? We can't take on all of the invasive species, so we have to be selective and systematic in how we choose which ones to target. Once we decide on a target species, what is the plan anyway? Is it to eradicate a species from a particular watershed or from the entire island? On Maui, we're working to keep Myconia out of the higher elevation forests of East Maui, but pampas grass is already in the upper watersheds of both East and West Maui, so we go where the target is. The situation and goals can be very different for the same species on a different island. It's also important to not leap before looking. When the tiny erythrina gall wasp arrived in the islands and started decimating native willy trees, the natural urge was to rush out and start controlling it. But before launching a massive operation, surveys revealed the wasp was already too widespread for that to be effective. And instead, entomologists from the Department of Agriculture and University of Hawaii headed to the native range of the invasive wasp, where they found some promising natural enemies. That was followed by rigorous testing and regulatory approvals to be sure the proposed biocontrol agent wouldn't harm other species. In the end, it was a very successful project that saved our iconic willy trees. So planning guided by solid research was the key to success in this case. So they claim it's working. How do they know? Any control strategy has to be able to measure progress. For Myconia, the aerial applications of herbicide-filled paintballs has proved to be efficient and effective for control of outlier plants. By tracking changes over time, Dr. Leary, who developed the technology, was able to show a steady decline in the density of Myconia over 9 operations. You see that in the graph on the lower left, and comparable decline in operational costs, the graph on the lower right, the lower left side, the right side, the lower left. For little fire ants, follow-up surveys showed that the presence of little fire ants in baited vials placed across the treatment zone decreased by more than 95%. The red dots in the top image show all the locations where baited vials had little fire ants. And the bottom image shows where the fire ants remained in only a few hotspots after the treatments. What had been Maui's largest little fire ant infestation has become one of its smallest. So treat, measure, evaluate, and report. These successes reflect not just trial and error, but also learning and adaptation. Sometimes folks ask, why are they still working on that plant or that animal or that insect? The answer is that eradications take time, sometimes many years. As the island-based invasive species committees and their partner agencies rack up success stories, invasive species professionals in Hawaii are developing new innovative strategies, ones that are being shared with partners across the state, the Pacific region, and even on the continent. Returning to the question of who they are, the folks doing this work are your neighbors, your former or current classmates. Many work the land, hunt, and fish for their families. They are family members who want to protect our islands from the harm caused by invasive species. And they are the kupuna on whose shoulders we stand, whose wisdom and mana'o continue to guide us as we work together to aloha aina. Mahalo for listening to us, and now for what I think is our last myth.
So as we close, a lot of people will just automatically assume if it's invasive, it's up for eradication. But as we've seen in some of the previous speakers, things like strawberry guava and albizia, and in some areas and on some islands, some target species are too widespread for that to happen. And that's another reason why it's very important to fund biosecurity. And that's because of the invasion curve. The invasion curve is something that's generally used to show how invasive species impact over time. As we look at this graph, you see that there's really 4 sections. There's prevention, eradication, containment, and management. And as the invasive species spread, and they spread across either an island or a state, the cost of managing those invasive species goes up. And that's also something that land managers have to contend with. Do we have the resources? Maybe. If we do we have the tools to do it? Sometimes the tools just aren't available. So this is something that has to be considered when talking about invasive species management. Not everything can be eradicated. Some species are actually beyond the point, and that's that red bar. We call it the point of no return, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not going to be managed. Unfortunately, this point of no return is usually when the general public realizes it's a problem, because that's either when you're getting stung in your yard or you're weeding plants in your backyard. However, if it had been caught earlier, we might have been able to eradicate it. But some of these plants have been here for 200 years or more, and they are at that point of no return. So then you just get to the point where you just try to either live with it or you control it locally. Most people in Hawaii participate at some level in controlling invasive species, whether it's you controlling roaches or ants around your house or any other invasive insects, or weeding your garden of invasive plants that are choking it out. So while most invasive species are too widespread for an eradication, that's that complete removal, they can be managed to protect the last of our remaining forest. Only about 10% of our priority watershed forests are currently protected. That means that they are either fenced in and invasive species removed so that we can maintain the ecosystem for those services that they provide us, like freshwater and erosion and flooding control. Also, if we can protect more of these watersheds, we can protect the endangered and threatened animals that are in there. We can also protect our agriculture, farmers, watersheds, and the nearshore reefs. So while a lot of these invasive species are widespread, it's not too late to continue to work on them. Much damage has been done, but there's still a lot out there to protect. Control efforts are happening all the time in our natural areas. Protecting priority watersheds and the habitats of threatened and endangered species is actually the tier 1 of invasive species management triage. When we have limited resources, you have to protect what's already intact. So protecting these watersheds is also going to increase our economic and agricultural sustainability. It's going to help resiliency to future climate change and weather patterns, and it's going to preserve Hawaiian cultural connections to our place.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, panel of experts, for such an amazing webinar full of like great facts that we learned today. $400 million a year on fruit flies, all the work we do on Hawaii Island and hopefully other islands, preventing semi-slugs for coming into our homes and landscapes and water catchments. Planting invasive species in our yards is like biological pollution for our neighbors. If I have somebody growing autograph tree like 3 lots down from me, like guaranteed a bird's gonna bring it onto my beautiful ohia trees. The bird's gonna excrete the seed, and then my ohia tree is gonna be full of an autograph tree trying to kill it. So I appreciate everything. Trevor, I didn't know about what's it called, the aquatic resource risk assessment. Like, I'm a land girl, like I just know about the Hawaii Pacific weed risk assessment. So it's really exciting for me to hear that you have a counterpart for the water. So thank you, everybody. I learned so much. And so we'll open this up to questions and comments. Jade and Kavehi, do we have anybody asking?
There is no questions from Facebook.
Well, good. Everybody explained everything. Clear, clear, clear.
We did have one question about pampas grass and how it arrived in Hawaii. Tea did answer it, but maybe she wanted to go over it for everyone.
Sure, yeah, just when did it arrive? I know for Maui, I'm not sure for the different islands. By Maui, it was first detected in around the mid 80s by Lloyd Loop, and then some of our other conservation greats noticed that it had been spreading further up country into Haleakala National Park. It's one of those species that can exist pretty much anywhere from the shoreline all the way up to dry areas. It likes it wet, especially like some wet, it easily invades disturbed areas. So if there's any kind of like a landslide or areas that pigs root around in, it readily establishes. So ecosystem modifier, it makes it a bunch grass, so it has these giant plumes and can easily spread. And then also it's another one of those species that can fuel wildfires as well.
I know in California with pampas grass, like once a fire comes and it goes up those plumes, the fire and the wind can actually spread the pampas grass seeds for over 2 miles. It's a really hardy plant and hard to eradicate.
Yeah, it has super sharp leaves, but it also the seeds, as we heard talked about before, about how different species are spread. The seeds can be spread by the wind several miles. That's how it gets from. And it's such a pretty, like so many plants, it's so pretty, has those giant plumes. People want to make nice crafty things out of them, but yeah, that's how they end up in someone's yard, and then the wind comes and moves them from their upslope into our native forests.
You know, speaking of pampas grass, I think that leads us into another important webinar that's coming up, Molly, that you're a part of, which is,
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
even though we've declared it eradicated here on Hawaii Island, we're always really on pins and needles about that and many other plants that could get here via the internet. And I know you're going to be talking about that.
We are, and today I just looked it up. I typed in pampas grass seeds, and there's a lot of big box stores and also Etsy sites. I can bring them to Hawaii Island and plant them at any time. But it's a matter of all of us as a community. Also, Hawaii Department of Agriculture, they already stretched so thin. How are they going to know if I'm getting a packet of pampas grass seeds in the mail? I mean, I don't know how they would know it. So say I get it undetected and I plant it. How's anybody going to know that I'm even growing it? One pampas grass population we found here on Hawaii Island, we only found it because we got to a dead end road and had to pull into somebody's driveway and turn around. And I looked back and I was like, that's pampas grass. And then we found another population that we never would have found unless we had backed into that driveway. So just, we cannot be all the eyes on the island, and it takes a community. It takes all of us to be knowledgeable and be on the lookout for invasive species, especially pampas grass.
We have a bunch of questions coming in.
Okay.
Clem wanted to know if this was being recorded, and yes, we're posting it on our YouTube. It should be there by next week. And there's a few other questions in here. One is, if you find something invasive in your yard, what's the proper method of disposal once you uproot it?
Well, I guess I would say, I'm not one of the panelists, but it's always good to talk to your local invasive species committee and find out, is it an eradication target? How best to control it on your island? And maybe it's something that's reportable and should be reported to 843 pest. 643, sorry, I'm dyslexic. 643
and I think it's good to really check on that, because the various species, you know, some things you just uproot it and that's it. Some things are going to reroot. Some things you might want to solarize. You want to put it in a black plastic bag. You know, each species is going to be different. If it's something that's already seeded, you know, you don't want to throw that seed into your compost pile or take it to the green waste. So I think really taking a look at what stage that plant is in. If it's very young, maybe pulling it out is all you need to do. But you know, being really conscious of that and reaching out to your local master gardeners, reaching out to your local ISC, reaching out to other, you know, places that you can get resources from, that what would be the proper way, because each plant is going to have a different method of disposal that's appropriate.
And just to pop in and add there, there's some good information on these very topics on some of the ISC websites. So just do some online Googling and looking. Yeah.
We have a question for Trevor. It looks like From Kimberly, what are the major vectors of aquatic invasive species and what can we do to prevent their spread?
So I would say probably the two largest vectors, one would be biofouling and ballast water in the shipping industry is a major problem. Ballast water being the water that's sucked up into the ballast of shipping containers and then can be released at a destination. And so any organisms that are sucked into that water, and can survive the trip and be released are potential invaders. And then another large one for aquatic species is actually the pet trade and aquaculture and yeah, like home gardening plants. We were just involved in a big project on Kauai a few years ago, removing giant salvinia from streams in Kauai. And, that's just like a gardening plant that was released into the wild and became established. So one of the biggest things we can do is some of it is regulation, with the shipping industry, but something that you and I can do is just not releasing, pets. A lot of freshwater fish sometimes that we have in our aquariums can become introduced and invasive. So not releasing pets, not releasing plants, and those kind of things, it really does have an impact.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Tanya wants to know, is there any weight of law, so to speak, regarding invasive species in Hawaii? Are people allowed to grow species that have been identified as invasive? And what is the authoritative body that addresses that? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I can talk a little bit about that because it has come up quite a bit as far as plants that there is a noxious weed list but which would be under the authority of the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. Unfortunately, that list has not been updated since 1992. And so it's not currently very effective for allowing for that kind of intervention with invasive species. And again, Molly's got an upcoming webinar with some other folks on looking, and Erin looking at invasive plant laws. So you guys might want to plug the date on that. But yeah, as far as animals, there are definitely restrictions on animals. That's much more restricted than plants. So when you're thinking about, what is okay to bring into Hawaii? In Hawaii, we have what we call a clean list and a dirty list with, with the different things. With animals, there's a clean list. These are the animals that are allowed to come into Hawaii, and that's it. If you're not on that list, you're not allowed. That's it. It's kind of the opposite with plants. We have a dirty list. These are the plants that are not allowed in Hawaii, and if you're not on that list, you're allowed. And it's not really working out great on the plant side, but there's a lot more restrictions on the animal side. And I do want to say that we have an animal industry webinar coming up as well on Valentine's Day and around lunchtime, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about the people who inspect animals that are coming into Hawaii, looking for diseases, looking for ticks, looking for, signs of other infections, and trying to keep us safe, because animals can also be a vector for bringing things into Hawaii. So it's very complicated. There is not one body that's responsible for that. There's different bodies that respond, and it would be a lot probably easier for all of us in Hawaii if there was just one list, but unfortunately it's much more complicated than that. Does anybody want to add anything? Molly, I don't know the date off the top of my head, but for people who are interested in the plant law stuff, I think it'd be really great for folks to sign up for that webinar.
Yeah. Do you know offhand?
Yeah, it's Thursday the 16th at 6 o'clock. And we'll have a legal fellow from Coordinating Group on Alien Pest Species speak to some of those issues and what's being done to move the ball along up the hill to try and get that changed.
Moving the ball up the hill. That's what Stephanie easily does all day, every day.
I just put the link in the chat for you folks that want to look at the different webinars that are being offered this month. You can go ahead and register for the Zoom links there. I haven't been looking at the Q&A. Someone asked if neon fish are present in Hawaii's freshwater streams? I know nothing about aquatic ecosystems.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. One thing that if we're while we're plugging things, and maybe I could check, we use iNaturalist, and I know that a lot of terrestrial people use it as well. It's a really great resource for us managers because if you're not aware of what it is, it's like a community organizing and data gathering site where if you see something in the wild, you can take a picture of it, you know, and post it of where you saw it, and you know, other people, you can identify it, or other people will identify it for you. And then we use it, especially with invasive species, to get a kind of an early jump, you know, a rapid response on things. And because we check it, you know, all the time, and if something comes up that catches our eye that's kind of unusual, we'll go check it out, or we'll send it, if it's on another island, we'll send a team to check it out. And so this is another great example. I can go on iNaturalist, just search the species and see if anybody else has seen it, you know, and has reported it, because there's so many more eyes out there from you guys, the public, you know, than we have. And so it's a really great way to just get a lot of data reported, you know, all over the islands. They're pretty well covered. And so, yeah, I can check that out.
I 100% agree with you, Trevor. And we have been really diving into iNaturalist as an early detection tool for the whole state of Hawaii. We are so lucky with all this like community input, citizen science, and AI technology to help us like identify plants, animals, you know, aquatic plants, and find out where they are. And then instead of driving around, you know, the whole island, like what, every 10 years, like once a year, you get all the roads, we have people telling us what's in their backyards, which we can't even see if we're driving around. So that leads me into our other talk on February 28th. What the bleep is this plant at 6 p.m. And we will go over myths, tricks, and tips for plant identification, but we're really going to be featuring iNaturalist because it's a great citizen science platform. It's helped us immensely. So I'm glad you use it for aquatics as well.
Kavei, I think I can quickly answer Bob's question. He asked simply, are cats an invasive species? And yes, they are an invasive species. So if you go back to that definition, are they not native to Hawaii? They are not native to Hawaii. They are introduced. And do they cause harm? They cause extreme environmental harm. And, you know, we see that not just with direct predation on birds, on native birds. We also see that with the disease toxoplasmosis, which is killing our monk seals, our endangered monk seals, and having just one seal removed from the population is a huge impact when you're talking about a critically endangered animal. So yes, we do consider cats an invasive species. I am a conservationist and I work in invasive species, and I have 2 cats. So, you know, we also consider cats to be pets. This gets into really complicated issues when we're talking about animals. So what we really are trying to work on is a couple of critical issues. Keeping cats indoors, especially if you live someplace that is close to a shoreline where there could be nesting shorebirds. I'm gonna guess a bunch of us actually have cats. And spaying and neutering, right? Spaying and neutering your cats. This could not be more important. When I talked about how invasive species have certain characteristics, they mature very quickly, they get to sexual reproductive age very quickly, and they can create a lot of offspring. Cats just fit the bill so perfectly. And so making sure that, you know, you're keeping your cat contained, you know, build a catio, put a cat-proof fencing around your yard, especially if you're in volcano or someplace, you know, high elevation where there's birds, places like Kauai where, you know, there's all those shorebirds and nesting shorebird locations. This is a huge problem. So it's really up to us because we still want our cats, to manage those cats and make sure that we are not allowing them to breed and we're not dumping them. That is just also one of the worst things you see in Hawaii is people dumping cats. So there's a lot of human behavior that's intersecting still with this particular invasive species that could be much improved and probably improve that for the cats as well as the environment.
Thanks, Franny. Okay, we have a few more questions. It looks like Tanya's dealing with a neighbor who's not as open to communicate or isn't available to communicate about the invasive species issue. How do you tackle that kind of problem where you're not able to connect with a neighbor? Anyone want to answer?
That's a really hard one, Tanya. It's really hard to have one idea and have people like not even consider it or even understand it. And actually, Franny and I went to a 3 or 4 day conference in Oahu in 2015 about getting our point across to people that do not see where we're coming from. And I guess my main takeaway is put a chink in the armor. Start small, find something that connects you, and then slowly chip away at it. Because I'm sure, as you understand, people will not just accept facts. They're not just going to listen to you, but like slowly, maybe you can find a common ground, like Coster's curse. Nobody likes that. Or autograph tree. How hard is that to get rid of? I don't know. Or like if you live next door to each other, this is blowing into my yard. I can see it seeding on your yard and moving into my yard, but say it nicer, not like that. But I feel you and I understand. And sadly, that's part of the problem here in Hawaii is we have very limited regulation regarding the cultivation of invasive plants. My family's from upstate New York and my dad has an orchid business there. Every year he has inspectors come to make sure he's not growing these noxious weeds on his property. And it's a quick survey, but he gets a letter of recognition every year saying, good job, Fran Murphy. You're not growing invasive noxious weeds, but we don't really have the resources here in Hawaii. So I would just say, start small, find common ground, and slowly chip away at it. But we wish you the best of luck. It's hard.
That's really great advice. How do you dispose of semi-slugs? Franny?
Maybe you can answer that one.
Well, I think the best way to dispose of semi-slugs is to keep a special slug jug. So what I like to do is like the old like coconut oil container, whatever container you can find, put some salt and water in there. 6 parts water, 1 part salt, I believe. And you can have some dedicated tongs or chopsticks. And when you go out and you find slugs in your garden or you go on a slug hunt at dusk, because that's often the best time to go and hunt for slugs, just put them in that slug jug and that's the best way. It gets kind of stinky after a while. So you just take that and pour it onto some weeds that you don't like. And that salt water will just kill the weeds.
I would like to also add one thing to that is it's all about reducing your risk for rat lungworm disease in general, like do the slug hunts like Kavehi said, but also trapping your rats and using Sluggo to control your semi-slugs. But also if you're doing a slug jug, don't use a yogurt container with a snap-on lid, which I did. And I thought it was fine. My yard is fenced, but I don't have a gate. Well, the pigs, wild pigs, could smell it, and all they smelled was salt and slugs, everything they wanted. And they came into my yard multiple times in a week to get to my slug jug because I didn't have it locked in very well. So do a threaded, which should be like obvious, but it wasn't to me. But now I know.
And I know in the chat earlier, but maybe we could put just a link to the Bisque web page where we do have a full webinar on rat lungworm, and it includes slug control.
I'll do that. Yeah, never touch slugs with your hands, with your bare hands.
I see that someone was asking if the koki is still a problem. I don't know if you can hear my audio. Obviously, yeah, it's definitely very established here on the Big Island. But I was thinking maybe Taya or Tiffany, I know that you guys are still battling koki, and maybe you guys want to speak to what's going on your islands with koki.
Yeah, go for it, Tiffany.
Sure. We had a breeding population, rather large one, that was eradicated in 2012, but unfortunately, it still gets introduced from inter-island trade, and that generally we have to have a rapid response to go collect the 1 or 2 koki frogs herd each night, and that ranges from like 5 to over 2 dozen a year. So if you hear koki frogs, especially if they sound like what's behind Franny when she's talking, report that, and somebody will come out and catch them for you on Hawaii.
And yes, still a huge issue on Maui. We have a crew of about 10 different people at any one time, sometimes 15 that are battling koki. They're mostly limited to the one particular gulch and then the surrounding areas around that Maliko Gulch on our North Shore. And then of course they also get into different single frogs get spread to different locations. And so we do like Kisk does and go out and do those one-offs. But yes, very much still a problem for some of our islands where, like we talked about, you have to choose which things you can work on. There's no way that you could do that. You could take that on Hawaii Island. It's just not feasible at this point. So, yep. And they also can help spread rat lungworm disease. So just something to be aware of.
There are communities on Hawaii Island. We're not a total goner, the whole island, but Kohala, North Kohala, they are working so hard to keep them in check and not let them spread too much. Oh my gosh. There's he's probably 75 years old now, Hiram. He owns Kohala Kentia Palm Nursery. He like rappels down these gulches and sprays citric acid. But that was 3 years ago, but the community there is banding together and they're working really hard for the most part. But that's part of the containment strategy and like what the community is willing to do in what areas.
And it's also something that I think about is that idea of who's carrying the burden for invasive species control. It's like everyone has weeds in their yard. Those are things that we don't want. They're obviously may not be as invasive as some of the ones that we go after, but whenever there is a decision that's made to take on or not take on a particular species, we often don't think about, well, what does that mean? Who does that burden shift to? And that's one of the things that that the invasive species committees work to do, is to engage community members, whether I know, like you talked about, with where you have community groups controlling koki frogs, and we have that on Maui, or just folks who help out with different elements of like, hey, we're all in this together, and our teams can't be everywhere. So the more that we can engage the community in helping to do that, the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, a lot of the times when we find new populations of different invasive insects, it's because we have people reaching out to us on Facebook and, through Instagram and things like that. So it really does take all of us to do this work. Okay, one more question. It's about what I think is a sweet potato bug Debbie's talking about. I have a blog from the Bisque page about this bug because we've been getting a lot of reports lately, a lot of people seeing this on their plants. So I'm going to put that in the chat and you can go in and learn more about the bug and how to control it.
It's swarm season right now for the sweet potato bug. I did an event last Sunday and we had at least 10 to 15 people come up to ask us about it. It's a sweet potato bug. It's been present on Kauai since at least 1996, something about that time. They didn't officially document it here on Hawaii Island until about 2016, but everybody's noticing it right now. And I'm not sure if any of the other islands are finding it. It's a bug. It kind of like has fat thighs. That's a really easy way to identify it.
I call it the thunder thigh bug.
Yeah, that's a great name. I call it the fat thigh.
Well, that's it for the questions. I don't know if any came in on Facebook. I don't think so.
Nope, we're still good.
Okay, well, thank you, Erin, Kim, Franny, Taya, Trevor, Tiffany, and of course, Jade and Kavehi for spending the evening with us and clearing up any misconceptions about invasive species. I had a great time tonight, and I hope everybody else did too. Aloha.
Thanks, everybody.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha.